You are officially invited. Yes, you're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. This is my 10-week group coaching program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start the first week of May. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 410. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health, because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today we're switching it up from the conception series last month, and I'm jumping into a brand new episode of my Pill Reality series. Today I'm sharing my interview with Annalise, and she is sharing her experience with the IUD. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. And I'm really excited to be here today with Annalise. Annalise is a member of the Fertility Friday community, and we connected, I'm pretty sure, over social media, likely over an inflammatory post about contraception. So I'm really excited to have you on the show to share your experience. And I'd love to start with my favorite question, which is, when did you have your first period? And let us know a little bit about how your cycles were and how you managed your fertility. And then that can lead us into your experience with, I think it was the Copper IUD, or it might have been a couple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I got my first period when I was 12. It was October. I remember it being like, my mom was really excited and I was very embarrassed, but it was overall a good experience. And my cycles were pretty easy. I don't actually remember what they were like that first year or so, but up until when I started messing around with contraception, my cycles were easy, regular, painless. My only concern was I was a swimmer, and I was always very concerned about swimming on my period. But besides that, it was easy.
Yeah, it's funny that you said October, because I had my first period in October. And the reason that I remember, because it kind of feels random. I'm sure there's plenty of women listening. They're like, I don't remember what month it was in, but I got my period in a church. I think my friends were being confirmed. I feel like that's memorable. Like if you start bleeding for the first time in a church. And then I went over to my friend's house, and on the TV was the hunt for Red October, and it was October and obviously the red part. So that's why. That's why I remember. All right. So your periods were pretty straightforward. I think any swimmers listening can appreciate that. It's pretty, especially when you are new to having a period, it's kind of terrifying how you're going to sort that out. So I don't know if you want to share how you sorted that out, but let us know what you did when contraception started to be an issue for you.
Yeah, I mean, swimming actually didn't end up being too big of a deal, because I noticed with my body, like when I was in the water, I didn't bleed. Actually, it was like gravity would kind of hold me up, and then I would start again when I got out of the pool or the ocean or wherever I was swimming. But yeah, so I started taking the birth control pill. I don't remember which brand, when I was 16. I took it for about 6 months and then stopped because breast cancer runs in my family. And the pill increases your chances of breast cancer, especially when you're taking it under the age of 20. And so I was like, okay, I got to get off of this. And so that's when I got on the Copper IUD. My doctor was like, oh, you don't want hormones? Easy. Like, we'll do this. And it sounded like the best option at the time.
Well, and so then how old were you, around the same age, around 16 when you had the Copper IUD?
I was 17.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the IUDs are such an interesting conversation. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there was a time when doctors were more hesitant to recommend it to women before they had babies.
Mm-hmm.
And now obviously that's changed. It's kind of now considered to be one of the best options because it's definitely a set it and forget it, highly effective. So tell us about what that experience was like having it inserted. I mean, with IUD conversation, it has come to my attention in very dramatic ways that I always need to ask about the insertion, if there was any pain or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, so spoiler alert for later, I've had 3 IUDs put in my life. I no longer have one in, I don't use them. But yeah, that first insertion, I had several friends that had tried to get it inserted and failed, quote. Like it didn't work and they were in horrible pain. And so I went into it pretty nervous. I remember being like really just scared that like something was going to rip or that it was going to be really painful or X, Y, and Z, the list of things that could go wrong. I remember it definitely being painful. And the thing was, and the difference between this one and the later IUDs that I got was the pain didn't really go away. Like it was just so inflammatory in my body. Like I felt like my body was angry at me. It was like everything in my body just hurt. Like, inflammation, it wasn't localized. It was everywhere. It was my neck. It was my head. It was my feet. I was like, what is happening? Like for days, weeks even. And it like began this process of me having painful periods for the first time in my life. It began this process of me like flooding the bed with my blood. I was bleeding so heavily. Whereas like before, like maybe I'd change a pad, 3-4 times a day. But like now I'd need to change when I got that Copper IUD and I'd have to change it every hour or so.
That's a huge shift.
It's huge.
Yeah. Well, so myself personally, I've always had pretty heavy periods. Later was diagnosed with fibroids. They've never gotten large, but they're small. And so, I kind of assume that it's related somehow to that. So even when you said that when you would swim, you wouldn't really need anything, for anyone who's had really heavy periods, it's like, wow, that's amazing. But that's a huge, huge shift. And I think it's clear by now at this point for anyone who's listened to the Pill Reality series and heard a few of the episodes about IUDs, but I have a real problem with this IUD insertion issue. From my perspective, it's such a basic thing to offer women numbing, and even to potentially, they have ways to dilate the cervix a little bit. So for example, if somebody is having like a DNC or like a pregnancy termination or something, they do have ways to dilate the cervix a little bit. There's things it can give you. And so I feel like this is just basic stuff. If you're dealing with a 17-year-old girl who's never had any babies, it would make sense to have a procedure as part of this process where they give you something the day before, you put it up, dilate. These things exist. I'm not a medical doctor, but I know that they do have the ability to do these types of things, or giving you numbing agents. My only concern with the numbing agent would be if they didn't dilate at first, like if it could cause damage, but that's still the same issue as not having a numbing agent, right? And you're not the first person who I've spoken to. So the experiences that I've heard on the podcast in the series have been quite different. So some women say very few, but there are a few who didn't really experience a lot of pain. So not everyone does experience this horrific pain. I did have one woman who I remember interviewing, and she shared that similar to your friends, they couldn't continue. So she couldn't even get it in. Like it hurt so much that she left without having the IUD inserted. And then several will report that it kind of hurts, but it's like a short kind of thing that that kind of stops afterwards. But several of the women who I've interviewed have shared that this pain, then it's like they can feel it for a week or two or whatever afterwards. And that's obviously your case. So how long did you have it inserted? And so it's kind of like a two-parter. And also, did you share these side effects and changes with your doctor? And if so, like, what was the response?
Yeah, I had that IUD in for about 8 months. And I did go to my doctor during that. And I was like, is this normal? Like looking for kind of validation. And I received validation that it was normal, that it was the IUD, that there wasn't actually anything wrong with me. But I wasn't offered anything other than like Advil to help with the pain. And so that was disappointing. And so I had about, probably 7 or 8 cycles of this 8 months having it in. And then one cycle came and my bleeding was all of a sudden really light. And there was horrible cramping, unlike before, but like I was bleeding really light. And then I was in college now, and I remember like walking to class and I was like passing out, losing consciousness. And like, I thought I was dying. Quite honestly, I couldn't figure out what was going on. And so I went to the doctor on campus, the nurse on campus, and she gave me a pregnancy test and it came back positive. And we did the blood test and it came back positive. And I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Like the whole reason I've been putting up with this pain, this bleeding, these horrible cycles is because it's supposed to be the most effective contraception on the market. Set it and forget it. And here I am sitting there 18 years old with an IUD and pregnant. It was the most mind-blowing and like awakening thing that's ever happened to me. Like I felt like in that moment that everything that I had been told about my body, about birth control, about my cycle was a lie. And I just remember being in this state of just like shock, absolute shock.
Wow.
And so I got it taken out.
Well, and so did the pregnancy continue or?
No, when they took the IUD out, I started to miscarry. I just started bleeding really heavily as they took that IUD out. And then I did go in for a DNC to make sure that everything was removed.
Mm-hmm. So there's one previous interview that I had where in this other woman's case, I think she had the IUD for years, if I remember correctly. And she ended up having an ectopic pregnancy. So I think it's interesting because before we started recording this, I actually was having a different conversation with somebody, and the topic of kind of informed consent was coming up. And, the question, I'll pose the question to you. I'm curious now, when you had the IUD put in, did the doctor go through potential side effects with you at all? Or was it like, even the potential for heavier bleeding and stuff like that? Like, did a conversation take place about potential side effects?
I believe it did. I was 17 at the time. This was a while back. I believe that a conversation did happen where she was like, some people experience heavier bleeding, but I do remember her saying like, but you are someone who has light bleeding, so that shouldn't be an issue. And she was like, and some people see more cramping, but you're a person who doesn't really have cramping, so it shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah. Well, and with the IUDs, I mean, I did already say, it's like on record that I said that they are listed as the most effective method. The Copper IUD is even listed as an emergency contraceptive. So
it is.
It's literally listed as one of the highest possible efficacy. But this, the point that I always think is really important to make. So given that I teach fertility awareness for contraception, anyone who's not on birth control, like a hormonal or has a IUD or implant or something inserted, knows that there's a chance that they can conceive. So if you're using fertility awareness, you know that there's a chance, right? We are all aware of this. So you have to have a conversation with your partner. You have to have a plan in place. But when you're using a copper IUD or the pill or the implant or whatever, I feel like it would be less likely with the implant. The implant is supposed to be the most effective in terms of the numbers. But either way, if you're having sex with another person, I still think that you need to have those conversations. Like in my personal opinion, even though the efficacy is high. But anyways, getting back to my point about side effects, the side effect that I think the doctor would probably never even consider saying, maybe not, is that you could conceive. And with the IUD, it's the worst because the IUD doesn't require you to do anything. So you're completely relying on the effectiveness of this device. And one of the things that struck me when you said that you had all this cramping, and light bleeding, I was thinking, well, where's the blood?
Right.
So for anyone listening, just even in a general sense, going back to, the vital sign, the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. I feel like we always need to be paying attention to stuff like that. So I feel like I've been talking a lot, but tell us a little bit about how that was like with you, with your partner in your relationship. Like, what was the fallout of this at 18 in college?
Yeah. I mean, so my partner and I, at the time, we weren't dating. We did go on to date for a couple of years after that. But at the time, we weren't actually together. And it was finals week of my freshman year of college. And yeah, it was quite a time. But I actually feel really empowered by how everything turned out. Like, it was the first big decision of my adult life. It was the first decision that like I knew that I had to make on my own based on what was best for me. And like coming from, a home and a background where it's like I was really taking care of other people, like to really put myself front and center like that and to know with absolute certainty what I wanted, like that was such an empowering opportunity for me. And like even going through the procedure of an abortion, even though I was already miscarrying, like we needed to help it along. We needed to make sure that all of the products of conception had been moved out. Like even that experience was really enlightening. I'd always told myself that I was the type of person who would never get an abortion, like that anyone could do whatever they wanted with their body, but I wasn't that type of person. And I had a lot of judgment around it. But when I knew that I was pregnant, like it felt so clear. Like there was not a question in my mind of like what I needed to do. There were lots of questions of how I was going to do it because I hadn't been educated on what that procedure looks like, what the options are, what it would cost, how I would even, get to an abortion clinic. I didn't have a car. So there were a lot of variables that needed to come together. But it was beautiful, like the show of support from friends. And I remember being very nervous about who I could tell and who I could ask for support. Like I was like, I need a ride to a place an hour away tomorrow. And it's finals week. Like, who am I going to ask? Who am I going to tell? Are they going to be okay with my decision? There's so much anger and, hate when we talk about this topic. But everyone that I talked to was so supportive. And most people had a story. They're like, oh, well, I had an abortion or my mom had an abortion. And like really validating that was an okay choice.
Well, and
yeah,
I don't know if this question is relevant, but I'm still curious. I think more so because now I'm a parent. Did you tell your parents? Did you tell your mom or dad?
Kind of. Yes. So it's come out in phases with my mom. My dad's not really in my life anymore. But after this whole thing, I was trying to decide what to do for contraception after this. And I remember talking to my mom about it, and I was just kind of in hysterics crying. And she was like, I really think that you should just go back on the Copper IUD. And I couldn't even keep it in anymore. I like blurted it out. I was like, I can't do that because I got pregnant with it in. And, my mom is very loving, understanding, also very religious. So, that did open up a conversation around like what happened. And so I didn't tell her the full story. She might listen to this podcast, and I think she'd be okay with it at this point. But I did tell her that I was pregnant and that I was later not pregnant.
Yeah. Well, and in your case, it's, I don't know. I don't know exactly how it went down, but it sounds like it was kind of in the middle. Because if you had to get this copper IUD removed and then you started bleeding, even in a case where a woman has a miscarriage, if that miscarriage doesn't fully, leave her body, if all of the tissue doesn't come out, it's life-threatening. So it's really important to be very aware of those types of situations and to be very on top of any type of unusual bleeding or bleeding that doesn't stop, because it's back again, like I'm like hammering the thing, but back to the vital sign piece. If you have bleeding or cramping, there's not supposed to be bleeding between periods. We can talk about a couple more common situations like spotting, but that's not supposed to happen. So just as like a public service announcement, certainly this came up in my practice several times last year with women having bleeding for many days or things like that. And the answer of what to do when you're bleeding is to go to the doctor. It's like,
Yeah.
what do? You go to the doctor, you get an ultrasound. If you're miscarrying or whatever the case is, you need to make sure that that's taken care of because your health is, it literally can kill you, right?
Yeah.
To have that
it can
tissue
be so
retained.
dangerous.
Yeah, because it can become infected and literally kill you. So it's really, okay, so I'm done. But I feel like I need to say that because it's crazy how used to pain and suffering, I think so many of us are. And even to kind of like irregular bleeding patterns and things like that. I mean, when you said to me after you described the pain and everything you experienced with the insertion and everything, when you said that you had the Copper IUD 8 more months, there was a part of me that's like it's more the kind of mothering older kind of perspective on that. Like, how could you put up with that much pain for that long? It sounds horrible, right? Like, it's just, but this is what we do, right? This is.
Yeah, I didn't know I had another option at the time. I was like, I'm not supposed to be using these hormones because of my risk of breast cancer. And, at the time, like, no one had told me about any sort of natural methods, fertility awareness. I didn't really have a lot of faith in condoms. So it felt like I needed to be on it.
Can I ask why? I'm always on this common thing.
Yeah, you totally can. It was just kind of hammered into me when I was receiving sex education when I was younger that like condoms alone are not enough.
That's so interesting. Did they actually say that?
Yes, they were like, if you are going to be having sex, you need to be using 2 methods. Like, and it should be hormonal contraception and condoms. That's what was taught to me.
I find that to be very interesting. I've said this many times on the podcast, I think. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I grew up in the AIDS era. And my sex education was, if you have unprotected sex, you'll get AIDS and die. So you need to wear a condom. That was literally, so like in my generation, I remember being taught that condoms worked. So I came out of high school thinking that I could use a condom by itself and that would be okay. So I find this I feel like this dialogue is really interesting just to hear how like the actual literal data and information has not changed. But what the messaging is that we're receiving is changing over time. And I think, of course, that it's being promoted by the pharmaceutical industry because there's a lot of money in contraceptives. Personally, that is my opinion. I had one other question before we kind of move on in your story. And that was around, or maybe question/comment, but you said that when you went to your doctor, like what you described to me was that before your periods were quite light. So you went from changing your pads like 3 to 4 times a day to once an hour. And then you mentioned that you had like no pain. And then now you had all this pain. And you mentioned that when you went to your doctor said it was normal. I feel like obviously no one's going to be surprised at what I'm going to say next. It's not normal. I mean, with the Copper IUD, there is plenty of research to show that, yes, it does. One of the primary modes of action is this localized inflammation that it creates in the uterus. And that is part of the reason why it prevents pregnancy, in addition to the copper ions being toxic to sperm. So there's a couple things going on there. And with that, yes, women do tend to have increased bleeding and many do have increased cramping, but going from like a 0 to a 10 and having that level of discomfort, that to me does not obviously, like, to be told that that's normal. How did you, I don't know if you have a comment on that. Like, sorry.
Yeah.
Like one last thing, I can't stop, but one last thing. It's like, looking back, do you think that it's normal?
Yeah. So I think at that age, at that time in my life, I lacked the vocabulary to actually tell my doctor what was going on.
Right.
Like, I just kind of went in, I was like, I'm bleeding a lot. And, I didn't have a metric. Like, I didn't say I'm filling up a pad every hour because I didn't know that was a metric that she cared about. I wasn't taught what a normal period looks like. I knew what was normal for me at that point, but I was like, maybe this is just normal. Like, I have friends that have really heavy bleeding. Maybe this is just what's going to happen from now on, which is horrible. Looking back on it, I'm like, oh my God, like I stayed on that for 8 months. And if I hadn't gotten pregnant, I would have stayed on it for longer. Like, I don't know how long, but that you can leave them in for up to 11 years. So looking back on it, no, it wasn't healthy, but I think it speaks to the need to really educate young women and young female-bodied people on what a period should look like and how to have conversation with medical practitioners, how to actually like talk to them in a way that you're going to get your point across, that they can understand what's going on, the severity of what you're experiencing. Because we're taught to use very like broad terms like, oh, I'm bleeding a lot. And then I hear the doctor say it's fine. And then I leave. Like, that's not a helpful doctor's appointment.
That is really interesting. I feel like that wasn't what I expected you to say, but it's like you're touching on this key issue. And on the one hand, I totally get why you're looking back on that and saying, I should have said this. And now for anyone listening, like as an adult human being, sure, yes, you know what I mean? Like even for the younger listeners, with this information, armed with it, yes, if you're going to the doctor, talk in their language, explain specifically how frequently you're filling the pads so that they have a more clear understanding. But on the other hand, the doctor is the one that went to medical school and they know when they're looking at you that you're like 18 years old. So when you're saying I bleed a lot, it's up to them to ask, what does that mean? So on the one hand, I totally get it because we all blame ourselves. Yes, I would too. I would look back and be like, yes, I would have gotten better care had I expressed myself better. But ultimately, who was the one who was responsible for that situation? All I'm doing, I feel like I'm just standing on pedestals. I'm like, all day. But this is how I feel, honestly, because it's ridiculous. If you picture an 18-year-old girl terrified in your office, again, this is what I say. I find myself saying this a lot to clients and women and whatever in situations like this. It was enough for you to call, like to pick up the phone, to call the doctor, to make an appointment, to put on your clothes and go. So it's not nothing that brought you there.
Yeah.
And it speaks to how, as women, I rarely have an interaction with a client or anyone who is female who hasn't had an experience like this in a doctor's office where something's happening and whatever you're saying is being minimized. It's a huge problem. It's a systemic issue. And it really is unfair then to put the onus on the 17, 18-year-old girl to have to describe things properly so she can get adequate medical care.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Thank you. Thank you for validating that.
Have you thought about it that way?
I mean, yes, but yes, I had. And as a practice of being an empowered adult, looking back on situations now, I'm like, okay, like what could I have done differently? Like not fully putting the blame on others, but yeah, it would have been nice to have those like direct questions and to have a relationship with my doctor where I felt comfortable really answering them. And yeah, just really talking to my doctor. That wasn't a relationship that I had.
Well, I think few of us did.
Yeah.
My perspective is definitely changing. I mean, I always say like, I look young, people meet me and I've always like had 10 because I know I look young, but as a parent now, and I think in my general circle, I think there's more like little kids and then like younger adults, like 20s. But if I'm literally sitting in front of a 17-year-old, you like anyone who is over the age of like 30, let's say, think of someone in your life who's actually 17, sit across from them and tell me at the end of the day, this isn't to say anything about 17-year-old. I went to university when I was 17, like my birthday's later in the year. So this isn't about anything other than it's literally a time when we are not as mature as we're going to be. It's literally as a time where we just don't have as much information as we're going to have. And it's such a vulnerable time because we rely on our practitioners, to support us. Okay, so I'm going to try to drop it, but I just like that really, when you said that, I'm just thinking like, yes, I totally agree with you that yes, like you would have gotten better care had you expressed it. But it kind of speaks to like, well, yeah, we know that it's going to increase the period volume. So whatever.
Yeah.
Go home, put on another pad. Like, wow, this can't be.
I was told to take more Advil, go home. I was like, okay.
All right. So you did say at the beginning of this call that you had the IUD inserted 2 more times. So tell us a little bit about that. Because I mean, that must have been traumatizing the first time. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it was traumatizing the first time. And so I had a couple months there where I was using condoms and it just really didn't feel safe to me to only be using condoms. Yeah, I was like very, very afraid. There's so much fear. I was like, if I get pregnant, my entire life is going to be derailed. Like if it happens again, I don't know what's going to happen. This like, I just remember this like crippling fear. And so did a lot of research and decided to go on the Skyla, which is like the low dose hormonal IUD, because I was like, well, maybe we'll try it out. And interestingly enough, too, while this was happening, I started working with a functional medicine practitioner to help with depression. I was very depressed that entire year having the Copper IUD in. And so I finally decided to get help, and I was able to go to a functional medicine practitioner, which I don't think many 18-year-olds do. And we did like a whole blood labs, whole blood panels. And I remember like everything came back totally normal. And then she was like looking at it and she was like, but you want to know what's weird? Like your copper levels are really elevated. Like you have copper toxicity. I was like, oh, weird. And, you know, we both kind of moved on, but she never asked me like about the Copper IUD. It never came up. And years later, I was like, I wonder if that was related.
Well, it couldn't not be. I don't believe, I'm not the type of person that's like, oh, wait, you were on the Copper IUD for 8 months. Oh, look, your copper is super elevated. That seems really weird. Like I'm the kind of person that's like 1 + 1 = 2. Stop it.
Yeah.
But interestingly that she didn't bring it up. It's the copper toxicity is interesting because being on a hormonal contraceptive can also kind of invert that balance between the copper and zinc. So literally like the Copper IUD can do it, but also hormonal. Isn't that interesting to think that a hormonal contraceptive could have the similar anyways?
Yeah. And I mean, the symptoms of it are tricky because like copper toxicity looks like a lot of other things. Like for me, it was showing up like low energy, depression, like headaches, like a lot of various things that we thought were thyroid for a while. And then like diving in, we're like, oh, it's copper. And it really did start to get better when I started treating it. But yeah, and at the time, like I've brought it up to several medical practitioners since then. And the general consensus in that community is like, there's no link between copper toxicity and the Copper IUD. And to me, I'm like,
that the Copper IUD literally releases copper ions. And that's one of the modes of action, like, except for that. I just have to say these things. It literally releases copper ions. There's research on how the copper ions interfere with the sperm transport and like are basically spermicidal. Like if it's literally a mode of action, it's like 1 + 1 = 2, please. Okay. It's time, ladies. Time to take your fertility awareness knowledge and confidence to the next level. Just popping into today's episode to invite you to join us for the next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. My 10-week group coaching program is designed to help you unlock the secrets of your menstrual cycle. Fertility Awareness Mastery teaches you everything you need to know about using fertility awareness cycle tracking to achieve your intentions. Whether you're currently trying to get pregnant, avoiding pregnancy, or planning to conceive in the future, we've got you covered. This program goes deep. Get to the root of your period problems, hormone imbalances, fertility challenges, and so much more. Early bird registration is now open, but only for a limited time. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode.
Yeah. It's so simple, like when you say it like that, but it's hard when you go to like from doctor to doctor and they tell you basically that you're crazy, that you're making it up.
These doctors, I mean, again, no shade on the doctors. I think it's always really important to think about people's experiences and then how it can, how do I say this? Like if I'm a doctor and I insert copper IUDs on a regular basis, but I don't believe personally that there's a link between the copper IUD and copper toxicity. If my belief is going to mean that I will never do a test I will never do a test to test a person's copper levels. And also a medical doctor, many don't necessarily do those types of functional type panels to look at all those nutrient deficiencies because it's not necessarily part of the paradigm of Western allopathic medicine. So legitimately, your perspective on this prevents you from ever seeing whether or not there's actually a link. Because you wouldn't know unless so the functional practitioners, for example, many of them may have come to a different conclusion, but they may regularly and routinely run these labs in their practice and find that women who've been on the copper IUD are more likely to have this copper excess in the labs. And so again, you could have two practitioners, both excellent, generally speaking, very educated, generally speaking, but because of their belief, one of them is going to come to a different conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think it just speaks to how much weight we put on medical professionals. So again, this isn't about throwing shade, but I always have the belief that if you're having a health issue, you know your body better than anyone else. So if something is not right, you are going to know more so. And if you go to a practitioner and they say it's fine, everything's great. Sometimes you need to go to a different practitioner, or sometimes you need to try a practitioner of a different modality so that you can get a second opinion. Ultimately, until you're better, you need to keep searching.
Yeah.
So
that it's okay to like look for second opinions. It's okay to like keep searching, second, third, fourth, whatever you need.
Yeah.
To get better.
Well, because someone telling you you're fine when you're not isn't helpful.
No.
It's called medical gaslighting. Like this is what it is. And ironically, right, there's no link, but you had this. So this is one of those situations where none of us can say 100% because you didn't do a lab before and after, but at the end of the day, like what else was going to cause that? Like this is okay. So even I could go a step further and say it doesn't even matter. What do we need to do to help you feel better? So I can even take that a step further and say, your opinion doesn't matter because I still don't feel good. And I still need to figure out why I don't feel good. So tell us what happened when you had the skylet inserted. What was that like?
I don't remember the insertion. So that means that I either blacked it out or it wasn't eventful. Like I don't actually remember that process of getting it inserted. But, I had that one in for about 3 years. I had it for the full term and I didn't mind it for the most part. There are a few things like looking back, like my PMS did get a lot worse. Like to the point, like for me, it showed up like whenever I was like a week out from my period and I saw one of those commercials where someone like a veteran's coming home from war, like I would just start sobbing. I don't know why. I don't know anyone in the armed forces. I don't know what that was about. But I would like be losing my mind, just like sobbing. And I was like, weird. That's not good.
I have cried at commercials before. You're not alone. But I get it. That's not normal. Yeah. I get it.
That was only on that IUD. But besides that, what I did like about it was I was bleeding. Like I was having a bleed. And that felt really good to me. But I never fully trusted it. Like I was never only using the IUD. I was always pairing it with either withdrawal or condoms. And even then I was like constantly terrified, just in a state of constant fear. Like, my bleed would come a day or two later than I thought it would. And I'd be like freaking out.
Yeah.
And so I got that one in. I got that one taken out. And then I went to Planned Parenthood to get another one put in. And when I got there, they were like, we can only put the Mirena in because of some insurance thing. And I was like, oh, the Mirena is a higher dose of the synthetic hormone. Like, I'm not really sure if I want that, but I was already there. I didn't want to make another appointment. And now this insertion, I will remember forever because they were training someone.
Oh no.
And
no. I'm already
they were
upset.
training. Oh, I will tell you this. Oh, so they were training this, like the most gorgeous man that I have ever seen in my entire
That's even worse.
life.
That's even
like
worse.
6'4", broad shoulders, gorgeous.
And meanwhile, he's looking at your vagina.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, he's trying to figure out how to get an IUD into my vagina, which apparently they were like, he's training, but he knows what he's doing. They did ask for consent. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever. And so he like tries to do it and he misses, I guess. So they have to throw it away, start over. I'm in pain because it's painful. They're trying to like open the cervix to get it in. And so he tries again, but this time to get a better view, I remember he put his hand on like the back of my thigh and I was very sweaty because I was in pain. And he looks at me and he's like, you are very sweaty. And I was like, are you kidding me?
Oh my goodness. How would you feel if I was about to take a toothpick and jab it into your penis? Do you think you might be sweating too?
I was like, this is absurd. And so he misses again. And this one's like even more painful. And so at this point, the woman who's training him, the doctor, is like, okay, I'm going to step in and do it. And so she did it and it was quick. It did hurt, but this time they had given me like 800 milligrams of Advil, like a higher dose than I normally take, as well as a heating pack. And so once it was in, it was okay. But I remember that insertion process and I was just like, is this a joke? Like, what is happening? And so I had that one in for about 3 months only. After that whole insertion process, I went down to Costa Rica and I was doing a yoga teacher training. And throughout those 3 months, I never bled. I didn't have any bleeding, and that bothered me. And at my yoga teacher training, we did a brief introduction to the 4 phases of menstruation: menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. And, this young yoga teacher woman was standing in front of me talking about the 4 phases and how we're a little bit different in each one, and what estrogen is, what progesterone is, maybe like a 15, 20-minute talk. And I remember spiraling because I was like, I didn't know that there were 4 phases. I didn't know anything about my body. And so I was talking to her and I was like, do you think the IUD impacts your cycle? And she was kind of laughed, and she was like, of course. And then kind of continued to talk to me. And I sat with that for the rest of the training that I was there. And I was like, I have not experienced my cycle since I was 16. I have not actually experienced what it means to be a cyclical being in a very long time, without the use of synthetic hormones or devices. And I'm living in a state of constant fear. This isn't working. It's not worth it. And so when I came back to the States, I was like, I'm going to get it out. And I don't really know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to get it out. And so at the time I was like, you know what? I'll figure it out step by step. At the time, I wasn't actually having sex. So I was like, you know what? I'll get it out, figure out birth control when I need it. Of course, 3 days after getting it out, I met someone and I was like, well, now I have to figure out how to prevent pregnancy. And so I was like, okay, what are the hippies doing? How do I get information? What are people doing that are not on hormonal contraception? In my mind at the time, the only people that I knew that weren't using hormonal birth control were my hippie friends. And so I was like, what are people doing? And I got so many weird answers, people making all sorts of tinctures and people using different devices.
Herbal things.
Lots of herbal things, which not that they don't work, but I just see them as a little dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. A lot of people relying on different things, and a lot more people than I thought that are just relying on withdrawal, the pull-out method. And I was like,
which ironically is a method, but very controversial for sure.
Very controversial. And to me, I didn't want to rely on that alone. Yeah. And so I just went through this exploration. I was like, who's talking about this stuff? How do I figure it out? And so longer than it should have taken, I found a copy of Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And that was really the start of it for me. I was like, oh, there's science. Oh, people have done studies. There's actually a way to figure out when you're fertile. You're not fertile.
It's biology.
Every day.
Oh my goodness. We can study
it's
this.
Biology.
I can put it on a chart.
Having that resource was incredible. And so I was self-taught for about a year, still using it very cautiously, never fully relying on it. Because I was someone who I really wasn't producing a lot of mucus. I was limited mucus. And so that's when I decided to start working with an HRHP, someone that I'd found online, and learning about my cycles. And I was like, yeah, I can do this. I can actually do this. I can actually prevent pregnancy and not be terrified every month. And it's I look back now that I've told that story, I'm like, I was so stressed out about that, every day of my life, either in the forefront of my brain or in the back. And now it's not a part of my life. That fear isn't here.
That's so interesting. I mean, I'm glad that you found fertility awareness after your journey. And when you were talking, I think part of your story, when you were sharing just again, how scared you were regarding the condoms, because you were taught that they couldn't be relied upon, and having to have 2 methods, which I think is fair. I really do. I support all the ways to, but at the same time, I find it so ironic because for the same reason many women are on birth control is the reason that I wasn't. So for my personal experience, I actually feel a lot more in control when I know what's happening in my cycle, when I know what day I'm on, when I know when I'm fertile, because if I know when I'm fertile, then I can be really intentional with my chosen method. during that time, I can make a point of using them correctly and things like that. And then I always know what's happening. So there's no pregnancy that would surprise me in that sense because I'm on top of the cycle. So I just think it's really interesting. And I'm really glad that you were able to find your way to that place where you can track your cycle and feel more comfortable, ironically, than when you were on some of those other methods. I think a lot of people who are somewhere else on their journey, still taking contraceptives or using the IUD, probably it's hard to imagine actually feeling more comfortable off those methods than on them.
Yeah. I mean, it was also such similar to my experience with the Copper IUD, getting that out, choosing to come off of birth control was one of the biggest decisions of my adult life. Really being I'm going to do something kind of radical here. I'm going to do something that most people in my life are telling me not to do, but that feels so right. That I had no doubt that was what I wanted to do. Again, there were doubts about the logistics, but I was I felt it in my bones, in my womb, in my body. I was I can't do this anymore. And so I think that enthusiasm and that high of actually listening to my body got me through the tougher parts of the learning phase, and even detoxing from the birth control, getting through all of that. It was I was just so excited to be able to connect to my body in that way and to be able to follow the guidance of my body.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for anyone who's listening or someone who tuned into this episode, maybe they tuned in because they're thinking of getting the Copper IUD or, because that's going to be in the title. But for anyone who's either, thinking about coming off contraception or thinking about switching to a fertility awareness type method, maybe in conjunction with another non-hormonal or barrier method, what would you want them to know?
Get education early. Don't try to do it cheap. It's so worth an investment to work with someone who actually has trained in this stuff to educate you and help you interpret your cycles and to make sure that you're cervical mucus in the beginning is very confusing. Learning to classify it, and each method, each app is going to tell you to do something different. It's really find someone that you think knows what they're doing and hire them, pay them. That was the greatest decision that I made.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm certainly biased because I did start with taking charge of your fertility. So I did chart independently for the first little while, but very soon after that, I was right in there with trained educators and learning the Just Dees method right off the bat. And so it's a game changer. It helps you to go from not really knowing what's going on and having all these questions and not really having answers to actually getting those questions answered and feeling a lot more confident about what you're doing. So I certainly agree that yes, it can cost money and things like that, but I think that it's important to consider making that investment, especially when you're wanting to rely on fertility awareness as your primary birth control method, because it can work and it can be a method that you can use throughout your whole reproductive life. It really can work for people. It worked for me for all these years, and it sounds like it's working for you. So just to give some encouragement to the ladies out there. Well, I want to thank you so much, Annalise, for coming on the show. This was great. I literally could continue talking to you for the rest of the day. I'm sure that I have at least 20 more questions, but thank you so much for sharing your story. There were so many aspects of your story, different experiences that you had. And so I know this episode is going to be really powerful for those who listen.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for this podcast and all of the content that you've released and your book. I'm a student at Just Dees right now.
Amazing.
And having all of your content, it's really helped me ground it in and make it accessible. You've just done such an incredible job.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet of you to say. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was such a great interview and I'm really excited to share.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/410. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. For more episodes in the Pill Reality series, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/pillreality, all one word. And for episodes in my fertility awareness reality series, so that series is a little different because, those are on-air client sessions and sharing experiences of women who are using fertility awareness, often transitioning off of birth control, many times avoiding pregnancy, sometimes trying to conceive. And so within those episodes, you also get a sense of some of those pill stories, whether it was a positive experience or a not so positive experience. And so I love doing this series because it just highlights the real experiences of women, just in their own words. They're able to share what happened. And I think it's so interesting. I think it's a little less controversial now. I feel like when I started the podcast, there was more opposition. You're painting it in a negative light. You're discouraging women from using birth control and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't think that I'm discouraging women from using birth control. We always need birth control. The question is, what kind is it going to be? Is it going to be hormonal? Is it going to be not hormonal? Is it going to be an IUD, or is it going to be a pill or a patch or a ring? Or is it going to be a barrier method, or is it going to be fertility awareness, or a combination of, barrier methods and fertility awareness? It's no one's discouraging anybody from being responsible and using birth control. But ultimately, we always have to be weighing that risk-benefit scenario and finding out what works for us. And that is, I guess, the biggest takeaway that I hope that you take away as you listen to these episodes, which is that everyone is not the same. And so everybody doesn't respond the same way. And what really, really worked for your girlfriend so well that she loves so much, to the point that maybe you were like, okay, that's going to be the method for me, could totally just not be the same at all. You could have a completely different experience on the exact same medication, where for one person, it could actually work really well, limited side effects, all that kind of stuff. Whereas another person can respond completely different to the exact same thing. And so, that's what I'm always hoping that these episodes are bringing to light. And also that we're listening to what women say, as opposed to ignoring what they say or downplaying it, or pretending like their experiences aren't real, like, oh, well, it can't be that bad. Like, yeah, it can, but it can also be great depending on who you talk to. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time.